Tell me about going to Canada and going to Saskatchewan.
Well, that was very moving because, of course, I was travelling out on the famous railway, the Canadian, which goes all the way from Toronto to Vancouver. And that bit of the railway journey, Harry would have gone along. That was the only way of reaching the interior. So I was looking out of the window of the train and seeing the very things Harry would have seen, these amazing woods you go through for ages and ages and ages, and then you get out into the prairies. And all I had to go by was his map coordinates of where his homestead was. And of course, the mapping coordinates in Canada have not changed since the 1900s. So if you've got a map and you know you have an ancestor who went out there to homestead, you can have a look on the internet, and the Canadian government, bless them, have put all the details up there. So I could find exactly where his homestead was. And it was so moving because Winter, where he lived, his real name, they were named alphabetically along the railway line. Winter is a ghost town now, there's nothing there. Just a ruined station, a ruined schoolhouse, and a few ruined farmhouses. But the land he ploughed is still under cultivation. It's a much, much bigger farm now. It's about 2.5 sections. It's huge. Back when he was there, it was just one little quarter section. But it was very moving to see that, okay, you know, he was there all that time and he sold the land, but it's still being farmed, so it didn't go to waste. It would be very sad if I'd gone there and it had all turned back into prairie, I think.
That must have been so surreal.
It was surreal, and I rented a log cabin as near to where his farm was as I could get, so I could hear the same birds and see the same flowers. And most of the research I did in the prairies was about nature, because the book is very much about a man living in the heart of nature at this point in the story, and I wanted to get the details right. And of course, I then had to get Canadian friends to read the manuscript to make sure I got it right. And one of them comes from a family of very keen bird watchers. And he frantically emailed me the week before, just before the book went to press, and said, "You can't put any starlings in the book. You've got to take all the starlings out." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "There were no starlings in the prairies until 1934.
Really?
Yep. Because there were lots of birds that only arrived because of the men who were farming. There was nothing, the things they liked to eat and do, they couldn't have done until there were farms there. So that was a whole other thing I had to get my head around, that man moving into the prairies and turning it into farmland had so changed the ecology and the flora and fauna that I couldn't, even the things I'd noted in my notebook, I had to then check, were they there before we got there?
Well, bless that friend of yours.
Yeah, I know. There are always, that's the thing with historical novels, you will always get something wrong.
Yeah.
That would have been a big howler.
It would have been a big one.
So I just replaced them with, small brown birds. Yeah. That's the handy thing if you're writing from the point of view of an Englishman going to Canada. He doesn't know very much.
Right.
So I can get away with not naming things or with him getting things wrong.
Now tell me about these themes of rape and murder. We meet Monk, who's a lot
He's a very scary
crazy.
man.
He's scary.
Yeah.
Were you scared of him?
I scared myself. If you're going to write a scary character, if they don't frighten you, they're not going to frighten the reader. So he had to be scary. Interestingly, he was named after a real-life person. 2 of the characters in the book are named after real-life people who bid in charity auctions to have a character named after them in one of my books. And one of them was it was very moving. He was a long-standing fan. I mean, I've written, 15 or 16 books. He was a long-standing fan, and he had died. And his sister bid in the auction because she thought it would be a lovely memorial to him to put him in the book. So I said, well, okay, I will make sure Paul Slaymaker, because that was his name, is the character everyone wants to marry. And he is. He's completely adorable. He's the sweet, gentle bear of a man. And then the other guy who bid was this Danish aristocrat who had a very, very long name, which included Munch, Troels Munch, but he had lots of other names as well. And when I got the email about him, I said, oh God, a Dane, how can I put a Dane into the prairies? And so I got onto Google, and thank God there were lots and lots of Danes and Norwegians and Swedes colonizing at the same time. So I could believably put a Danish character in. But then I started to think, what if he was a really bad Danish character? And then this idea of the psychopath came to me. So I then emailed this aristocrat, who was a very sweet man, and said, would you mind awfully if I make you a psychopathic rapist?
What did he say?
And there was the kind of email equivalent of a pause, and then he emailed back and said, no, it's fine as long as you make me hot. so Troels Munch is very frightening, but he's also worryingly sexy.
Well,
I had a lot of fun with him. But it's partly to do with being historically accurate.
Yeah.
When I looked at the settlement map and saw how far apart these men and the very few women were, I realized how vulnerable they would have been if a rapist or a murderer moved into the middle of that tiny, vulnerable frontier community. They could have wreaked havoc and nobody would have known. And one of the frustrating things about pioneer history is that most of the paper gets lost. Because these guys were living in tents or in soddies, which were houses built with turf over a little wooden frame. They weren't dry places to live. So their precious personal paper tended to get destroyed or burnt if they were cold or whatever. So the precious records that do come down to us tend to be the legal ones and the government ones. And so I spent a lot of time in law libraries in Canada reading accounts of trials from this period, from the prairies. And there were some wonderful accounts, really vivid, of rape trials. Very few, because there were very, very few women there until about 1920 or so. And what was so horrific with these trials was how little things have changed. You know, the judges clearly didn't believe the woman. They thought she was just a, you know, a slut who was trying to get away with it by, you know, pinning it onto somebody else. And in two of these accounts, the judge said to the woman, well, why didn't you scream? Or why didn't you scream louder? And in both cases, the woman in the account said, well, Your Worship, I didn't scream because the nearest neighbours are 5 miles away and I knew they wouldn't hear me, and I thought if I was quiet, the ordeal would be over with sooner. And so the judge dismisses the case because he thinks, well, obviously she was enjoying herself. So I thought I have to put a rape in here. And I ended up putting 2 rapes, but I don't want to give away too much of the story.
Don't do it.
But it is a very, very upsetting scene, I think. You don't see the actual rape, you see the aftermath of it. But it's always this difficult thing. I teach a lot of creative writing, and I always say to the students, if you're going to kill somebody or rape them or whatever in your book, you better make sure it's a character the reader loves. Otherwise it won't have the right impact. It'll just seem salacious. So I worked really hard building up this female character to be somebody that the reader would completely adore, so that when the rape happens, it's that much more upsetting, and you are that much more angry as well. You want to grab a knife and go and kill him.